Okay, now we're off to lecture 8. Let's find 8, shall we? Okay, so lecture 8, we're shifting back to domestic policies. We're going to pick up where we left off when we were talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won a large re-election in 1936. Swept into office, or re-swept into office with long coattails, bringing lots of Democrats along with him. He has what's known as high amounts of political capital. Political capital means the ability to get things done in Washington, D.C. He has it at his fingertips. He has been personally validated by the American public with a large vote. He has control of both the House and the Senate, and he signals what his intent is in his second inaugural speech. Inaugural speeches that we discussed previously, they're very important because they tell us about how the president views his goals for his term of office. So he's been reelected, and he gives a very famous speech in which he says, I see, paraphrasing here, I see 1/3 of the nation ill-clothed. I see 1/3 of the nation ill-housed. I see 1/3 of the nation ill-educated. And he says, and we can do better, right? So this is a completely different view of the role of government. So in the first inaugural speech, he's talking about things as an emergency in which unusual things have to happen right away. And the federal government is going to take on a new role. This attempt is discussing a completely different way of seeing the way government interacts with its public, right? He's talking about not just a government that's going to act in an emergency, but a federal government who sees as its responsibility the effort to improve people's lives. This is a markedly different view of the role of federal government. He gives this speech, and it's wildly popular. The crowd goes wild, the media goes wild, the public goes wild, Congress goes wild. Everybody thinks this is a great idea. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt has enormous political clout at this moment. So it's interesting to see what his first step is. Rather than acting on what is seen as this new role of the federal government, one that the public greeted very warmly, he embarks on a different effort, and it's known as the court packing scheme, right? So this is an effort for Franklin Delano Roosevelt to change the way the Supreme Court operates in a sense. So what prompted this? The Supreme Court overturned a piece of New Deal legislation, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt responded very unhappily, right? So put ourselves in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's shoes. So he has had enormous impact as president, very popular. The Congress is full of Democrats, very popular. But here we are entering his 5th year of term, and he has not appointed a single member of the Supreme Court. He has had no impact on the shape of the Supreme Court. For example, Warren G. Harding, in his 3 short years, named 3 people to the court. So the court is doesn't align itself, or it doesn't have people on there that Franklin Delano Roosevelt has put on the court, right? So as we talked previously, the Supreme Court has a spectrum of opinion, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt doesn't think the Supreme Court reflects this new opinion. So when the Supreme Court overturns a piece of New Deal legislation, rather unexpectedly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt announces a new plan, right? The reason why he does so is because the piece of legislation that was overturned was part of the AAA legislation, right? The Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is part of his first 100 days legislation. And Franklin, and this was unusual action, but wasn't really truly radical. What Franklin Delano Roosevelt fears is that if the Supreme Court is overturning legislation from the first 100 days, which was unusual but not really radical, he fears what's going to happen when they begin to take up cases from the second 100 days, which was much more radical. So he fears that the Wagner Labor Act is going to be overturned, minimum wage law, but what he fears most is that his program of Social Security will be overturned. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt decides to respond, and he wants to change the makeup of the Supreme Court, but he doesn't state it that baldly, right? You can't state these things baldly like that when you're trying to convince the Congress and the public of what you want to do is more high-minded. So he says the following. The justices of the Supreme Court, the 9 of them, he says, are really burdened with a very heavy load. And it's not fair because many of these justices are older. And it's not fair to place this weight on their shoulders when they're older. So he proposes that for every Supreme Court justice over the age of 65, a new Supreme Court justice will be added to the court to help carry the load, is how he says it. So he's promoting this as an idea that he's going to help the Supreme Court, but the truth of the matter is he wants to add new members of the Supreme Court that are going to be more reflective of his views of governing, right? So this idea is not well received by anybody aside from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's a very bad and unpopular decision. The public doesn't like this concept of messing with U.S. institutions. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is aware that the United States Constitution, nowhere in the Constitution does it say there will be 9 members of the Supreme Court. It says there will be a Supreme Court. It makes sense to have it as an odd number so you don't end up with cases on equal sides, right? So it makes sense to have an odd number, but nowhere in the Constitution is it written that there will be a 9-member court. And as a pretty good constitutional scholar, he knows that in the past, these things have been different. For example, during Reconstruction, Congress added another member to the Supreme Court, and there have been times when the number has fluctuated. But the general American public was not aware of that. And so they don't see this as a number that has been in flux. It hasn't changed in a number of decades, right? It had been at 9 for a while. So the idea that the president's going to mess with one of the 3 co-equal branches of the government, the judicial branch in the form of the Supreme Court, doesn't sit very well with them. Further, it's not something that the Congress is very excited about, particularly the people who are going to have to decide on this, the United States Senate. His argument is that the court is too old to do the job. But he's making this argument to the United States Senate, which is full of old men. In order to get to the position of senator, you have to have a political career where you build up experience and chits, right? People who owe you favors. And when you land the job as a United States Senator, it's a pretty sweet gig. So people don't like to give it up. So you have people in the Senate who serve for an extended period of time. They're going to have to vote in favor of the president's idea that the Supreme Court is too old to do the job, while these guys are just as old or maybe even older, right? So it's not popular in the Senate. It's not popular in the public. And people pretty quickly or almost immediately see through that this is really not about helping the Supreme Court. It's really about shaping the Supreme Court for the interests of the president. And people don't like it, right? Further, what is upsetting to Leuchtenburg, our author, and this is where you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit to try and get a sentiment. Leuchtenburg's distressed because this is completely unnecessary, right? So the Supreme Court, Franklin Delano Roosevelt should have anticipated the arguments that were going to be made. The Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court says, thanks for the help, but we don't really need it. This court has ruled on more cases in a shorter period of time than any Supreme Court in history. Therefore, we're not holding things up. We're not falling behind. We don't need the help, right? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't have an answer for that, something that he should have known the Supreme Court would be able to say. Further, it's unnecessary because the Supreme Court was going to rule in his favor anyway. So to go back to the case that set off Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was upset about, well, historians are of different minds on this, whether or not he was upset that the NRA codes were thrown out, right? There are some that argue that he wasn't upset because the NRA codes weren't achieving their goals. There are others that say he really was upset, right? At any rate, he pointed to the NRA codes, which was 9-0 ruling, as we have seen previously. But this AAA legislation, or the part of it that was thrown out, it was a 5-4 ruling, which means 4 members of the court believed it to be constitutional. The one swing vote, Justice Owen Roberts, was very careful in explaining why he voted with the majority to throw this case out. Supreme Court justices, and here's it's good to know a little information about how these court rulings are reported. When a case is decided, the Chief Justice assigns a justice from the majority side to write up the explanation, the legal interpretation explanation they relied upon to reach that decision. He or she will also pick the minority side and appoint somebody to write up the summary of the minority report, right? But any Supreme Court justice can write their own explanation for why they made the ruling they did, right? So Justice Roberts, in this case, in which he ruled 5-4, very carefully explained why he thought this portion of the law was unconstitutional. And he gave very strong signals in his ruling that he's not opposed to the idea of the presidency acting in these unusual fashions and ruling them unconstitutional. He just said, in effect, this one didn't pass muster, not that he's opposed to the whole idea, right? And then there's additional information that the court was not willing to rule out of hand these new legislation approaches or legislative approaches that were coming out as part of the New Deal. When the Supreme Court, when they hear a case, and as we'll see later when we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, when they hear a case, they're on their own time schedule, right? So they will hear a case, they'll argue it, they'll issue their ruling in private, and then they'll write up their reports, and then they're released later. So when the report or the decision is reported out with the justifications from the justices, it's many weeks or months after they've made a ruling, right? After Franklin Delano Roosevelt had started this court packing scheme, but the ruling was released, but the case was argued and decided before he began this court packing scheme. So it's not in relation to it. And what this case ruled was in favor of some of this New Deal legislation that had come before the court, in which Justice Roberts had said, had signaled very clearly that he supported this idea that the executive branch and the government had to operate differently in the case of this emergency of the Great Depression. What in effect it means is that Roberts said in a case that was decided before and came out later that he was going to support the president. So the president had the support of the Supreme Court in a 5-4 ruling and was likely going to enjoy that 5-4 favor in future cases, right? This is where Leuchtenburg is decidedly unhappy with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He, as he refers to it, he said, Roosevelt had his Dutch up, which means he was angry about this. And so instead of saying, okay, this is not a case I can win, I should cut bait and move on, he continued to pursue it, even when it became clear that this effort was going to fail. It was going to fail in the Senate, and it was deeply unpopular with the people. He continued to pursue it, and as Leuchtenburg says, most gallingly of all, it was unnecessary. It was just a matter of his pride that he had promoted this and was going to continue to promote it until he got what he wanted. The Senate gave him a face-saving compromise They didn't change the number of people on the Supreme Court. They didn't add new Supreme Court members. They made some changes at a lower federal court circuit. But this was really face-saving. This was an embarrassing loss for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as Leuchtenburg says, unnecessary, because over the next 2.5 years, he got to shape the court the way he wanted by naming 5 new justices. And he named them the old-fashioned way. The justices retired or died, right? So they didn't change the total of the court, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt did put his stamp on it over the next 2.5 years. So he achieved those goals of the Supreme Court without having to do it in the fashion that he had initially promoted. What makes this court packing scheme remarkable and damaging for Franklin Delano Roosevelt is that it was really unpopular, and it cost him political capital with the public, and also capital in Congress, where some members had begun to feel that they could oppose Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The upshot is it's one of 3 elements that occur in this 1937 year that begin to undercut the power of the president to achieve his legislative outcomes, right? The other, a second element that occurs that costs Franklin Delano Roosevelt political power is the activities of industrial unions. So labor is on the move as a result of this passage of the Wagner Labor Act. And industrial unions reach out to industrialize or to organize the industrial workers in a variety of sectors. As we have seen previously, since we talked about Homestead and other relations of ownership to workers, the steel industry was a site that people were very resistant to workers forming into unions or negotiating with them. Another large industry or industrial sector that's strongly opposed to the rights of workers to unionize is the automobile sector. Excuse me, and it is in the automobile sector that there is another case or there is an effort that is successful for the workers, but is something that is seen as radical and improper by the American public. And it's known as the Fisher Auto Body sit-down strike, right? So the workers at General Motors are wanting to form an industrial union, and ownership and management of Fisher or of GM is opposed to it. Now we know from discussing Homestead that when workers go on strike, they go out and pick it out in front of wherever they're on strike with the effort to make their displeasure known, to not work, and to prevent other people from coming in. Well, at the Fisher Auto Body plant, the Fisher Auto Body plant is a particular choke point for GM production. There are a variety of different cars, but they all are built on the same type of chassis. And the Fisher Auto Body plant made those chassis. So they were a component of GM production that went across various lines, as they refer to them, of different makes of vehicles. They all had the same chassis they were built upon. So when the workers went on strike at Fisher Auto Body, it's going to have a big impact on the production of GM. But Fisher Auto Body, the strike adopts a relatively new tactic. Instead of going out front and picketing, and refusing to work and trying to prevent people from coming in, a place that exposes them to the efforts of companies to break up strikes, the workers decide they're going to have a sit-down strike, in which instead of leaving the building, they sit down in the building and refuse to work, right? This effort means that the building, the factory, is occupied by the workers. They're supplied by their Confederates outside who pass food and other things through the windows to keep them sustained, but the workers themselves aren't leaving the plant and they're refusing to work, right? So the sit-down strike puts them in different positions. So GM refuses to recognize the rights of workers to form unions, so they adopt the usual tactics. They file a court case saying that the workers are stealing their property by not allowing GM to operate the plant. The courts rule that they are illegally trespassing by staying in the property. So the police come to evict them, right? So when the police show up, as opposed to normal strikes where they're out front, this time they're inside. So when the police try to come in and evict the workers from the building, the workers resist. And in this particular plant, they climbed up into the rafters and they were armed with some of the equipment that GM had there. In particular were the hinges that they used to hang the doors, right? So they went up into the rafters, and when the police came in to evict them, they started hucking these metal pins and other things at the police, and they drove the police out of the building, right? So they're unable to evict the strikers. So the strike continues, right? The police, it was called the Battle of Bull's Run, right? Bulls is a nickname for police. So GM goes to the next level. They go up to the governor and say, we need your assistance to evict these people from the plant who are on strike and refusing to work and let us use their property. Only now the political world has changed, where previously the government had served as a strike breaker of last resort. That's no longer the case. So when GM approaches the governor of Michigan says, not only am I not going to give you the Michigan State Guard to evict these people, he says, I'm inclined to go down and occupy the plant with them. He's in favor of the workers, because now the workers forming industrial unions have political might. Faced with this dilemma that they're unable to use the normal recourse to evict people or bring in scabs, that workers occupying the plant carries with it the threat that if they do succeed in forcing them out, there's probably going to be a lot of damage to the equipment left behind, and by the political reality that the governor is not going to help them, and in fact is siding with the workers, GM capitulates. And so GM negotiates with the workers as a collective, as an industrial union, right? This works very well for the workers, the industrial workers, and they're all very excited about it. But this is very unpopular with the middle class in the United States, who say, in effect, this is a stealing of GM's property, right? They steal this property and extort a new contract from the owners. What if my little dry cleaning plant, what if the workers go on strike in a sit-down strike there? Will they steal the plant from me and the government won't help me? So it's a radical approach that is unpopular with a fairly large segment of the American public. In terms of the strategy for the workers to unionize, it's very successful. GM recognizes the rights of industrial workers to form unions. Ford is the last one to come on board, and there were some bitter strikes with Ford before they finally capitulated. But United States Steel, right, which is the steel industry is one of the most implacable foes of unionization, they gave up the fight without even a strike. When workers began to talk about going on a sit-down strike, steel industry said, we recognize your right to unionize, and they began to negotiate with the workers, right? So for the industrial workers, this was very popular, but for great segments of the American public, it was not. And so this had cost Franklin Delano Roosevelt political capital, because he didn't feel the need to step in on this process. He said, he tried to adopt a neutral tactic, but he said this is something that should be worked out between the workers and the companies. The third element that eroded Franklin Delano Roosevelt's popularity and his political capital is the economy hit the skids over the summer of 1937. Right? So the economy was beginning to recover through the Great Depression as part of this New Deal. Some of the things that the government was doing were helping the economy begin to tick up, and it appeared that the economy was on its way to recovery in 36, 37. One of his economic advisors in 1937 convinced Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the government, which had been accruing debt because it was spending more money than it was taking in, should shut down some of the spending so that it would limit the amount of debt that the government was acquiring. He said, in effect, it's time to take away the crutches. The economy is ready to walk. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was persuaded by that. And he was concerned about the debt the government was accruing by these programs. So in the summer of 1937, he cut the programs to save money and reduce debts. He cut government spending, right? Because these programs are funded by the federal government, and these people who are getting paid through works programs or the arts programs or other sorts of ways of getting money into the public's hand, this is government spending. And so by cutting that, it reduced a lot of the money being injected into the economy coming from the federal government. And it occurred at the same time that less money was in the pockets of the public because the Social Security tax was beginning to be taken from their paychecks. So at the same time, you have a new tax, that's taking money out of the pockets, out of the paychecks of workers, and then you couple that with the government slowing down some of its spending. The small economic recovery collapsed, and it began to plummet down the mine shaft again. The economy began to plummet down the mine shaft again. So here we are, 1937. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's in his second term. He cannot credibly call it Hoover's depression any longer. These are economic disasters that Franklin Delano Roosevelt owns. And so as the economy crashes again or becomes worse again, it had never emerged from its economic doldrums. It would just look like it might be beginning to emerge. When it crashed back down again, Franklin Delano Roosevelt loses even more popularity. So these three events over the course of the spring and summer of 1937 cut away at that amorphous, unmeasurable thing known as political power. You know when somebody has it because they can make things happen. You know when people begin to lose it because they can't achieve their goals. And one of the things about political power is that political power, it's a currency that you spend to achieve things you want, right? And every time you spend it, it eats away at its power. One of the things you can spend it on is in rewarding people who support your program. So you're giving them political favors out of your stock of favors, right? So that's one way you can do it. The other thing that gets people to act the way you want them to do in a political form is that they're afraid of you. So they're afraid to cross Franklin Delano Roosevelt because they're going to suffer some sort of punishment. So his political capital can be used to reward people, or it could be used to punish people. So even if you don't necessarily agree with what the president's trying to do, if you're afraid to cross him, this results in an expenditure or an example of his political capital as well. What happened in the spring and summer of 1937 is that some of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's political enemies begin to find each other and begin to form alliances, and they're not as fearful of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the obvious people who are opposed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plans are the Republican Party. Roosevelt's a Democrat. The Congress is full of Democrats, many of them very radical Democrats. Their approaches are in opposition to what the Republicans want, right? But within the Democratic Party, there are some very conservative members of the Democratic Party who are primarily located in the American South. So the American South, the former Confederacy, and the border states, they're full of Democrats, but they are very conservative Democrats, and they're not generally in favor of these more radical solutions that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is proposing. So these Republicans begin to find common ground with these conservatives from the South, who begin to bind together to thwart some of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's political plans. Part of the reason is they're beginning to see Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a lame duck. He's in his second term. He's losing political capital. each day he's one day closer to no longer being president. So these folks feel emboldened to resist some of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt's hoping to achieve. This results in what's a period known as the Revenge of the Conservatives, who these conservative Democrats join with the Republicans to try and block New Deal legislation that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's proposing as too radical. In 1938, Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed a new batch of must legislation, much as he did for the second 100 days. New legislation designed to give a very prominent role for the federal government. One of the things these Southern Democrats believed in is that the federal government was too powerful and they wanted to emphasize state and local governments. A good reason why they wanted to promote the power of state and local governments is because state and local governments were the forces that emboldened Jim Crow legislation to operate, right? So if the federal government rules and trumps state laws, they could sweep away Jim Crow legislation, this segregation legislation that white Southern Democrats very strongly favor, right? So they bind together and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's must legislation fails in 1938. They see him as a lame duck, and they begin to pitch him almost the same way as the fascist states of Europe are acting. So they're referring to Roosevelt as a dictator. In his second term, the midterm elections in 1938, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is determined to buck up his political power. And the way he decides to do that is something that was not unprecedented, because we saw it with Andrew Johnson, but exceedingly rare in American political life. Franklin Delano Roosevelt targets members of his own party and seeks to prevent them from winning their primaries in favor of candidates he supports. He goes before the public and tries to raise support for the candidates he wants to replace other Democrats. He refers to these other Democrats as copperheads, right? These Southern Democrats are copperheads because they're snakes in the grass. They say they support Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his plans, but then they work to prevent the passage of this legislation Roosevelt claims is designed to help the public, right? So he says, vote out these folks and vote in these other folks who are going to be Democrats, right? This is almost unprecedented. As I said, we saw it with Andrew Johnson. The president is the head of the party, and generally the president works to foster the interests of the party. The longer people are in Congress, the more power they amass. So one of the things that results in power in Congress is a result of seniority. The longer you're in the Congress, the more senior positions you get. So when you're on a committee, the committee chair is the most senior member of the majority party. So by seeking to remove members of your own party, you're actually weakening the party's overall. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt says this is important, right? So he supports these other candidates in the Democratic primaries in the South, and most of the candidates he supports lose. The incumbents win, and so now the incumbents are even less inclined to work with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Further, the midterm elections between Democrats and Republicans results in a setback for the Democrats. The Republicans pick up 81 seats in the House. That means 81 seats that were formerly Democrat have been flipped to the Republican Party, and they are now expanding the power of the Republican Party in the Congress. 81 seats in the House, 8 in the Senate. Still, they're a minority, but they're becoming a more sizable minority. And it's a sign that people are not favoring Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his approach, right? In addition, 13 governors, formerly Democratic or held by Democratic candidates, are now turned into Republican seats, right? So 13 governorships also flipped in this 1938 election. Franklin Delano Roosevelt has no coattails. right? Or very little coattails. Nobody he is trying to put his imprint on is succeeding, and people opposed to him, even if they are in the same party, are succeeding against him, right? He has no perks, he has no goodies to give out because people are becoming, his promises are harder to deliver on, right? Because he's, as they see it, approaching near the end of his term. And members of Congress are less inclined to be afraid of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They say, what does it matter? You're not going to be here in a year and a half, 2 years anyway. So this frittering away of his political capital in his second term results in less ability to achieve what he wants. Right. So next time we will pick up again with issues of foreign affairs.